The egg cracked slowly, and a small wet claw pushed through the shell first, testing the air before the rest of the body followed. Inside the nursery of Halvern Station, 3 Tavreni caretakers stood ready with warm cloths and soft words, but the moment the hatchling opened its eyes, it did not look at them. It looked past them, straight at the tall human standing quietly near the back wall, and made a small clicking sound that none of the caretakers had heard before. Daniel Hale had not expected to be in the room at all. He had only come to drop off a crate of temperature sensors for the hatchery when Elder Voss, the head caretaker, asked him to stay a moment, since the hatchlings often calmed faster with a still, quiet presence nearby. Daniel had agreed without much thought. He liked animals, he liked quiet rooms, and he had nowhere else to be that morning. He did not know that by staying, he was about to change the next several months of his life. The second hatchling broke free an hour later, and it too turned toward Daniel the instant its eyes adjusted to the light. Elder Voss watched this with growing unease. Tavreni younglings imprinted on one steady figure soon after hatching, a bond that shaped how they ate, how they slept, and how safe they felt in the world. It was supposed to be a Tavreni bond, passed down through careful training and tradition. It was not supposed to happen with an outsider who had wandered in to deliver equipment. Voss considered removing Daniel from the room immediately, but the hatchlings began to cry the moment he stepped back, a high thin sound that made the whole nursery tense. Reluctantly, Voss allowed Daniel to stay a little longer, if only to keep the peace. That little longer turned into the rest of the day, and the rest of the day turned into a request, made almost apologetically by Voss, that Daniel consider taking on part of the hatchery duties. Daniel was not a hatchery specialist. He was a xenobiologist by training, more used to studying alien plants and writing reports than raising 2 demanding, sharp-clawed infants. But something about the way the smaller hatchling pressed against his hand, as if checking that he was real, made it hard to say no. He asked the station doctor about it, read every file he could find on Tavreni development, and within a week he had unofficially become the primary caretaker of the clutch. The larger hatchling grew bold quickly. It liked to headbutt Daniel's palm whenever he sat still for too long, demanding attention with short, impatient chirps. Daniel started calling it Rel, a name he picked simply because it was easy to say and easy to shout across a room. The smaller one was quieter, more careful, and spent its first days hiding behind Daniel's leg whenever a loud noise passed through the station. He named her Sela, and she seemed to like the sound of it, tilting her head every time he said it. Elder Voss watched all of this with a mixture of worry and reluctant respect. Humans were still new to the Tavreni, only a few years into a shared research agreement that neither side fully trusted yet. Many of the older caretakers believed a human could never truly understand the needs of a Tavreni hatchling, that the bond would be shallow, or worse, that it would fail entirely and leave the younglings damaged. Voss had believed something close to that too, at first. But days turned into weeks, and Daniel proved surprisingly steady. He learned to prepare their food exactly the way they liked it, slightly warmed and cut into small pieces. He learned that Rel liked to be talked to constantly, even if the words made no sense to a hatchling, and that Sela calmed fastest when he hummed old human songs under his breath, off-key and unpolished, but familiar in its rhythm. He sat with them during storms, when the station's hull groaned under pressure changes, and both hatchlings pressed close to him, shaking. Word spread through the station. Other researchers came by just to see the human who had somehow become a full-time hatchery keeper, half expecting to find him overwhelmed or the hatchlings unwell. Instead, they found a small, functioning routine, 3 figures curled together in a corner of the nursery, 1 human and 2 young Tavreni who refused to eat from anyone else's hand. Nia Ferris, a communications officer and one of Daniel's closest friends on the station, teased him about it constantly, calling him the strangest parent in the sector. Daniel laughed it off, but he noticed that he had started rearranging his whole schedule around the hatchlings without even meaning to. He skipped meals in the mess hall to eat beside their enclosure instead. He gave up his evening off to sit with them until they fell asleep. By the time 2 months had passed, Daniel could not walk into the nursery without both hatchlings scrambling toward him, chirping and climbing over each other for space near his hands. He had stopped thinking of it as a temporary duty. It had become, without him quite noticing the exact moment it happened, the center of his days on Halvern Station. He had no idea that a routine supply run, scheduled for the following week, would soon test that bond in a way none of them were prepared for. The supply run was supposed to be simple. A small shuttle, a short trip to a relay beacon at the edge of the system, a routine check of its diagnostic systems, and a return before dinner. Daniel had volunteered for it almost as an afterthought, mostly because the station's regular pilot had come down with a fever and someone needed to go. He told Elder Voss he would be back the next evening, and he told Rel and Sela the same thing, crouching by their enclosure and promising he would bring them something from the beacon stores if he could find anything interesting. Rel chirped happily at the idea of a gift. Sela, always the more watchful of the two, pressed her head against his hand and did not let go for a long moment, as if she already sensed something Daniel did not. The trip out was uneventful. Daniel ran the checks on the beacon, exchanged a few words with the automated systems, and loaded a small crate of spare parts the station had requested. He sent a short message back to Halvern Station confirming everything was normal, then began the return trip. It was the kind of job that barely made it into anyone's memory afterward, forgotten within a day under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. Halfway through the return flight, the shuttle's core sensors picked up an unexpected object drifting nearby, tumbling slowly against the backdrop of stars. Daniel adjusted course slightly to avoid it, more out of caution than any real concern. Seconds later, his communications panel filled with static and a garbled voice, not his own, crackled briefly through the speakers before cutting off completely. The last thing Halvern Station received from him was a fragment of a message, mentioning debris and something closing in fast, before the signal went dead. No wreckage was found. No distress beacon activated. The shuttle, and Daniel with it, simply vanished from every sensor sweep the station could run. Nia Ferris was the one who noticed first that something was wrong, when Daniel's shuttle failed to check in at the expected time. She waited an extra hour, telling herself he had probably lost track of time chatting with the beacon's maintenance systems, something he was known to do. When 2 hours passed with no word, she went straight to station command. The search began quietly at first, a standard sweep of the return route, expanded slowly as nothing turned up. Nia pulled every sensor log she could access, cross-referencing them against known shipping lanes and old records of debris fields in the area. She found nothing conclusive, only the same unsettling gap in the data that everyone else had already found. It was as if the shuttle had simply stopped existing. Tavreni Command was informed within the day, as required by the Joint Station Agreement, but their response was slower and more cautious than Nia would have liked. A single missing human, however well liked, was not automatically treated as an emergency worth diverting patrol ships for, not when the Tavreni Council had other, older concerns weighing on its attention. Councillor Brask, who oversaw resource decisions for the outpost, made it clear in the first meeting that a full search effort would require solid evidence that Daniel was still alive and reachable, not just hope. Back in the nursery, the hatchlings noticed his absence long before anyone explained it to them. Rel refused the food offered by a substitute caretaker that evening, pushing the dish away with his snout and chirping loudly toward the door, as if calling for someone to walk through it. Sela said nothing at all. She curled into the corner of the enclosure farthest from the food dish and did not move for hours, her eyes fixed on the entrance Daniel usually came through. Elder Voss tried everything she knew. She warmed the food differently. She offered it by hand the way Daniel always had. She even tried humming, badly, the same tune she had heard him hum during storms. Nothing worked. The bond that had made Rel and Sela so healthy and calm over the past months now worked against them, refusing to accept comfort from anyone who was not him. By the second day, both hatchlings had eaten almost nothing. Voss recorded their weight and behavior carefully, trying to keep her own worry out of her notes, though it crept in anyway. She had seen imprint bonds fail before, always among Tavreni caretakers who left their posts or grew careless, but never one this strong, and never one broken this suddenly and completely. Nia, meanwhile, refused to accept that the search was over just because the first sweep had found nothing. She spent her off hours going through old station logs, looking for any record of similar disappearances near the same stretch of space, and found 2 brief, half-forgotten reports from years earlier, describing unexplained losses of small ships along the same route. Neither report had ever been fully investigated. She began building a case to bring back to command, certain that something out there, something not natural, had taken Daniel. By the end of the second day, Station Command made it official. Daniel Hale was listed as missing, his fate unknown, his shuttle presumed lost. The words felt too small and too final for what had actually happened, and nobody who worked closely with him believed them completely, especially not Naya, and especially not two young Tavreni hatchlings who had stopped eating the moment he disappeared and showed no sign of starting again. By the fifth day, the nursery had gone quiet in a way that unsettled everyone who walked past it. There was no chirping, no scratching of claws against the enclosure walls, none of the small, restless sounds that had filled the room for months. Rel and Sela lay curled together near the far corner, barely lifting their heads when the door opened, their scales dull instead of the healthy shine Elder Voss had grown used to seeing. Voss brought in a Tavreni physician on the third day, once it became clear that ordinary coaxing was not going to work. The physician examined both hatchlings carefully, checking their weight, their reflexes, the color of their eyes, and delivered news that Voss had already feared but had not wanted to say out loud. Imprint grief, the physician explained, was rare but not unheard of, and it could turn fatal within a matter of days if the bonded caretaker did not return or if a new bond could not somehow be formed in time. Neither option looked likely. Voss had spent decades raising Tavreni younglings, and in all that time she had never once imagined she would be fighting to save a clutch bonded to a human. She had also never expected to be the one arguing loudest for that human's return, but that was exactly the position she found herself in now. She began attending station briefings she normally would have skipped, pushing for updates on the search, asking pointed questions that made some of the Tavreni officials visibly uncomfortable. Counselor Brask found himself at the center of the disagreement. He was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one, responsible for weighing the outpost's limited resources against every request that came before him. A single missing human, he argued in one tense meeting, could not justify pulling patrol ships away from other duties, not without stronger evidence that a search would actually succeed. He had seen searches like this before, ones that consumed time and fuel and ships, and still ended with nothing found. Voss did not back down. She brought the physician's report into the meeting herself, laying out in plain terms what would happen to the hatchlings if nothing changed soon. She reminded the council that the joint hatchery program had been built on trust between the two species, and that abandoning the search now, over what amounted to a bureaucratic hesitation, would tell every human on the station exactly how much that trust was worth. Brask listened, visibly unmoved at first, and ended the meeting without committing to anything further. Naya Ferris, unaware of exactly how dire things had become in the nursery, kept working her own angle from the communications deck. She had not stopped digging since the day Daniel vanished, convinced that the gap in the sensor data was not a coincidence. She widened her search to include supply manifests from nearby trade routes, cross-referencing anything unusual against the time frame of Daniel's disappearance. Most of it led nowhere, dead ends and outdated records, but she kept at it anyway, driven partly by loyalty and partly by simple stubbornness. On the fourth night, she found something. A faint anomaly buried in an old sensor sweep, a brief gravitational disturbance near the edge of the debris field, consistent with a small vessel using a hidden pull field to drag another ship off its course. It was not much, barely more than a smear of data most analysts would have dismissed, but it matched the timing of Daniel's last transmission almost exactly. She brought it straight to Station Command, working through the night to build a case strong enough that no one could easily wave it away. Meanwhile, in the nursery, Elder Voss sat through the long hours of darkness with the hatchlings curled against her, though they barely responded to her presence anymore. She began talking to them quietly, not expecting an answer, describing small memories of Daniel from the past months, the way he hummed off-key, the way he always saved the best pieces of food for Sela without ever announcing that he was doing it, the way Rel used to headbutt his hand until he laughed. She did not know if the hatchlings understood any of it, but she kept talking anyway, unwilling to let the silence in the room win completely. By the morning of the fifth day, Naya's findings had made their way through enough channels to force a second council meeting, this one far more urgent than the first. She presented the anomaly clearly, laying out the timing, the location, and the pattern that suggested a deliberate interception rather than an accident. Brask studied the data for a long moment, and for the first time since the search began, his expression shifted from caution to something closer to concern. He did not fully commit to a rescue effort in that meeting, not yet, but he agreed to authorize a single scout ship to investigate the anomaly directly, a small concession that felt enormous to everyone who had been fighting for it. Voss, informed of the decision soon after, allowed herself the first real breath of hope she had felt in days. It was not a guarantee. It was barely a chance. But as she looked down at Rel and Sela, both too weak now to do more than lift their heads slightly at the sound of her voice, she decided a chance was more than enough to hold on to. The cell Daniel had been kept in for the past 5 days had no windows, only a dim strip of light along one wall that never fully turned off and never grew brighter. He had learned the shape of it entirely by touch during the first night. 4 steps wide, 6 steps long, a metal bench bolted to the floor that served as the only place to sit or lie down. He had counted the days by the meals brought to him, small and irregular, delivered by crew members who never answered a single question he asked. The ship that had pulled him in was not military, not pirate in any organized sense either, but something in between, a scavenger crew operating far outside any territory that either humans or Tavreni patrolled closely. They had used a hidden pull field to drag his shuttle off course before he even understood what was happening, and by the time he regained his bearings, his ship's systems were already being stripped for parts by a boarding team that moved with practiced efficiency. He had fought briefly, uselessly, and been knocked unconscious for his trouble. When he woke, he was already locked in the cell, and the crew leader, a lean figure with a voice roughened by years of breathing recycled ship air, explained the situation in blunt terms. Daniel was valuable, not for ransom exactly, but for information, technology access codes, station layouts, anything that might be useful to sell later. They intended to hold him until they decided how best to use what he knew, or until he decided to make that decision easier for them. Daniel gave them nothing. It was not bravery so much as stubbornness, a quiet refusal that came more naturally to him than he expected. Every time they asked a question, he answered with something useless or evasive, wasting their time without giving them a reason to escalate. He did not know if this strategy would keep him alive much longer, but he could not bring himself to hand over anything that might put the station, or the people on it, at greater risk. What kept him steady through the long silent hours was not hope of rescue, which felt increasingly unlikely the longer nothing changed, but the simple habit of counting. He counted the meals. He counted the number of times the light along the wall flickered before steadying again. And more than anything, he counted the days since he had last sat beside Rel and Sela, turning the number over in his mind like a stone he could not put down. He thought about them constantly, more than he expected to, more than he thought was reasonable given his situation. He pictured Rel pushing his hand for attention, Sela pressing close during a storm, and each memory made the cold metal room around him feel slightly less unbearable, if only for a moment. He had promised them he would come back with something interesting from the beacon run. He had not expected the promise to become the thing he clung to hardest. Far from that cell, the search that Naya had fought to start was finally gaining real momentum. The scout ship authorized by Counselor Brask reached the coordinates of the gravitational anomaly within a day, and its sensors picked up faint traces of a larger vessel's engine signature, while hidden but not perfectly so. The scout ship's crew, a mixed team of human and Tavreni personnel working together for the first time on a mission this serious, relayed the finding back to Halvern Station immediately. What happened next moved faster than Brask had expected. Word of a possible lead spread through the station, and support poured in from directions he had not anticipated. Off-duty engineers volunteered their time to prep a response ship. A Tavreni patrol captain, who had crossed paths with Daniel during equipment deliveries and remembered him fondly, requested to lead the rescue personally. Naya insisted on going along, refusing every attempt to keep her behind on the station. Even Brask, watching the effort assemble itself almost entirely on volunteer energy, found himself quietly moved by how many people, human and Tavreni alike, were willing to risk something for one missing crew member. The joint response team departed within hours, faster than any operation Halvern Station had organized before. They tracked the engine's signature carefully, staying just far enough back to avoid detection, until they located the scavenger vessel drifting near a small, uncharted asteroid cluster, using the rocks as cover from routine patrol sweeps. It was smaller than expected, poorly maintained, clearly built more for stealth than for real combat. The rescue team moved in under cover of the asteroid field's natural sensor interference, cutting engines early and drifting the final stretch in silence. Boarding pods launched quietly, aiming for a weak point in the scavenger ship's hull that the scout data had identified. Inside, alarms began blaring the moment the boarding team breached the outer plating, and the ship's crew scrambled to respond, caught off guard by an assault they had clearly not expected to face. Back in his cell, Daniel heard the distant tremor of impact through the walls before he understood what it meant. The lights flickered, the ship shuddered, and for the first time in 5 days, he allowed himself to hope that the sound outside his door might mean something other than more bad news. He stood, steadying himself against the metal bench, and waited, unsure whether he was about to be rescued or simply caught in the crossfire of whatever was happening beyond the door. The door to Daniel's cell blew open with a burst of pressurized air, and for a moment all he could see was smoke and a bright cutting light where the lock used to be. Then a figure stepped through, armored and unfamiliar at first, until the voice behind the helmet called his name, and he recognized the Taverny patrol captain who used to trade jokes with him during equipment deliveries. Daniel had never been so relieved to hear someone mangle the pronunciation of his last name. The fight for the ship was already mostly over by the time he was found, the scavenger crew overwhelmed faster than they expected by a boarding team that had trained together for exactly this kind of operation. Daniel was walked quickly through smoke-filled corridors, past crew members being secured by the rescue team, and into a waiting shuttle that pulled away from the scavenger vessel within minutes of the breach. He did not fully believe he was safe until the shuttle's engines fired and the wreck of his cell shrank away behind them. Naya was waiting on the response ship when he was brought aboard, and she hugged him hard enough to make him wince, laughing and scolding him in the same breath for scaring everyone half to death. Daniel, exhausted, dehydrated, and lighter than he should have been after 5 days of irregular meals, managed only a tired smile in return, though the relief in his eyes said far more than words could have. The trip back to Halvern Station felt both impossibly long and strangely fast, Daniel drifting in and out of sleep in the medical bay while the ship's systems worked to stabilize him. The moment they came within communication range of the station, word spread quickly through every deck, reaching Elder Voss within minutes of the ship's arrival being confirmed. She did not wait for a formal announcement. She went straight to the nursery. Rel and Sela had grown weaker still over the past day, barely responding even to Voss's presence anymore, curled together in a stillness that had begun to frighten every caretaker who checked on them. Voss knelt beside their enclosure and spoke as gently as she could manage, telling them, though she was not certain they could still understand her, that he was coming back, that he was almost here. She had said similar things before without result, and she braced herself for the possibility that it might already be too late. Daniel insisted on going to the nursery the moment the medical team allowed him to stand, ignoring the doctor's protest that he needed rest first. He was still bandaged along one arm, unsteady on his feet, and clearly running on nothing but stubbornness. But nobody who saw the look on his face tried very hard to stop him. Naya walked with him, half supporting his weight, all the way to the nursery doors. The room was quiet when they entered, quieter than Daniel had ever heard it. For one terrible second, as he looked at the two still shapes curled in the corner of the enclosure, he thought he might be too late. Then Sela's head lifted, slowly, as if it took everything she had left, and her eyes found him across the room. What happened next was not slow at all. Sela let out a sound Daniel had never heard from her before, sharp and desperate, and threw herself against the enclosure wall hard enough that Voss rushed forward to open it before she hurt herself. The moment the barrier came down, both hatchlings surged toward him, stumbling on legs that had barely held their weight an hour earlier, and collided into him with a force that nearly knocked him off balance. Daniel dropped to his knees right there on the nursery floor, wrapping his arms around both of them at once, and for a long moment nobody in the room said anything at all. Rel pressed his head hard against Daniel's chest, chirping in a broken, urgent rhythm, while Sela buried herself against his side and did not let go, shaking in a way that had nothing to do with weakness anymore. Voss brought the food dish over herself, her hands unsteady, and set it down beside them without a word. Daniel picked up a small piece and offered it the way he always had, warmed slightly, held out flat on his palm. Rel took it almost instantly, swallowing it in a hurry as though afraid it might disappear again. Sela hesitated only a moment longer before doing the same, and once she started, she did not stop, eating with a desperate steadiness that made Voss's eyes sting in a way she was not entirely willing to admit out loud. The rest of the nursery staff gathered quietly at the doorway, watching, along with Naya, and even Counselor Brask, who had come to check on the outcome of the rescue he had reluctantly authorized. Nobody spoke much. There did not seem to be a need to. After days of silence and fear, the small ordinary sounds of two hatchlings eating from a familiar hand felt like the loudest, most welcome noise any of them had heard in a long time. Daniel stayed on the floor of the nursery long after the dish was empty, one hatchling on each side of him, neither willing to move more than a few inches away. Voss finally convinced him to let the medical team look him over properly, but only after Rel and Sela had fallen into an exhausted, peaceful sleep pressed against him, the first real rest either of them had managed in days. Even then, he refused to be moved anywhere out of their sight, and nobody in the room had the heart to argue with him about it. Daniel had recovered fully within a few weeks, though the station doctor liked to remind him at every checkup that 5 days of scavenger rations were not something to shrug off so easily. He had gone back to his usual duties eventually, splitting his time between his old research work and the hatchery, unable to fully step away from either. Most mornings, before anything else on his schedule, he still walked out to the juvenile pens first, and both Rel and Sela still abandoned whatever they were doing the moment they heard his footsteps approaching. Elder Voss had changed too, in ways she did not always announce out loud, but that showed clearly enough in how she ran the hatchery now. She no longer treated the bond between Daniel and the hatchlings as an unusual exception to be managed carefully. She spoke of it openly to visiting officials, held it up as proof that the imprint tradition could stretch further than anyone on the council had believed possible. In a quiet ceremony that surprised Daniel more than he expected, she formally recognized him as a full member of the Tavreni Caretaker Order, an honor she admitted privately had never before been given to anyone who was not Tavreni. Counselor Brask's shift in thinking took longer to show itself, but it showed. In the council sessions that followed the rescue, he became one of the strongest voices arguing for deeper cooperation between the two species, citing the search for Daniel as proof of what a combined effort could accomplish when both sides committed fully to it. He never became a warm or sentimental man exactly, but he stopped treating requests involving humans as automatically less urgent than requests involving his own people, and that alone marked a real change from where he had started. Naya teased Daniel about all of it constantly, telling anyone who would listen that he had somehow managed to become both a decorated rescue survivor and an honorary alien caretaker within the same season, which she considered deeply unfair given how little sleep she had lost helping make either thing happen. Daniel usually just laughed and let her have the joke, though he made sure, more than once, to tell her seriously how much her stubborn digging through old sensor logs had mattered. Without her refusal to let the search die quietly, he doubted he would have made it back at all. On quiet evenings, Daniel sometimes found himself thinking about those 5 days in the cell, the counting, the silence, the way the memory of two hatchlings had kept him steady when almost nothing else could. He did not talk about it much, not because it was too painful, but because the ending had turned out so much better than he had let himself hope for at the time. He preferred, most days, to focus on what came after rather than what had almost happened. The juvenile pen sat at the edge of the station's outdoor dome, open to a filtered view of the stars, and it was there that Daniel spent most of his free evenings now, sitting on an old bench while Rel and Sela explored the wider space around them with the confident curiosity of creatures who no longer expected the world to take something away without warning. Rel had grown into a bold, restless presence, always testing the limits of the enclosure, always the first to investigate anything new. Sela remained quieter, more careful, but she had stopped hiding the moment things grew loud or unfamiliar, choosing instead to stand a little closer to Daniel and wait things out beside him. Word of what had happened at Halvern Station traveled slowly through both human and Tavrini channels over the following months, told and retold with small variations depending on who was doing the telling. Some versions focused on the rescue itself, the joint operation that had moved faster than anyone expected. Others focused on the hatchlings, on the strange and powerful bond that had nearly cost them their lives and then, against fairly steep odds, had saved them instead. Daniel never much cared which version people preferred. He knew what mattered to him. On the evening marking exactly 1 season since his return, Daniel walked out to the pens later than usual, delayed by a maintenance report he had needed to finish. He half expected to find both hatchlings already curled up for the night, but instead they were waiting by the enclosure gate, watching the direction he always approached from, the way they seemed to do every single evening whether he was late or not. He crouched down as he always did, and both of them pressed close immediately, Rel nudging his hand impatiently, Sela leaning her head against his shoulder without a sound. Daniel sat with them a long while under the filtered stars, in no particular hurry to leave, thinking that whatever else had gone wrong out at that beacon months ago, this part, at least, had turned out exactly the way it was supposed to. Some bonds, he had learned, were not easily broken by distance or silence, or even by disappearing without a word. Some bonds simply waited, however long it took, for someone to come back.